Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Plato's The Republic was never meant to be a static philosophical exercise. It was a blueprint, a diagnosis of democracy's deepest vulnerabilities, and a warning about the cycles of political decay. His argument was not just about ancient Athens, but about the very nature of power, governance, and the illusions that sustain them. This episode does not treat the Republic as a relic of the past, but as an active framework, a lens through which to examine the current state of American democracy. We are not claiming that history is repeating itself exactly, nor that Plato foresaw every nuance of modern politics. But his insights into how democracies unravel, how public trust erodes, and how the pursuit of unchecked freedom can lead to its opposite remain disturbingly relevant. This is not a polemic, it is an attempt to apply Plato's structure to the present, to explore where his warnings resonate and where they require reinterpretation. As institutions shift, as political power consolidates, as democratic ideals are stretched thin, we must ask, if the Republic were being written today, what would it say? Plato's vision of democracy was not the utopian ideal many assume it to be. It was a fragile experiment, a delicate balancing act between freedom and order, reason and impulse. His warnings about its slow unraveling, written over 2 millennia ago, resonate in the corridors of power today. The Republic spoke of a system destined to consume itself, where the pursuit of liberty untethered from wisdom would eventually give rise to chaos, and chaos would invite the arrival of something far worse. This was not prophecy, but a cycle observed across history, where democracies drift toward their own undoing, lulled into complacency by the comforting belief that the system, however flawed, will always endure. The illusion of choice is perhaps democracy's most insidious trick. It presents itself as a marketplace of ideas, an arena where the best and brightest rise to leadership through the collective will of the people. But in practice, the choices are curated, pre-selected, shaped by forces that exist far outside the public eye. In America, elections are framed as great ideological battles, yet behind the spectacle, the machinery of influence remains unchanged. The candidates are different, but the financiers, the lobbyists, the corporate donors remain constant. It is a system that thrives not on democratic ideals, but on the careful management of mass perception, where public sentiment is manipulated with surgical precision. This was not always so blatant. Decades ago, the illusion was subtler, the mechanisms less visible. Now, in 2025, the system does not even attempt to hide itself. Super PACs openly fund campaigns with billions. Social media platforms amplify messages in ways no public institution can regulate, and a handful of unelected billionaires wield influence greater than entire elected governments. This is not democracy in its purest form. It is an algorithmic oligarchy dressed in the language of representation. The Republic speaks of a moment when democracy, having abandoned its philosophers, turns to demagogues. A leader emerges not out of wisdom, but out of the people's frustration. They do not offer solutions, only enemies. They are not chosen for their ability to govern, but for their ability to channel resentment into power. This is how democracies transition into something else, something darker. At first, this new leader appears as a necessary disruptor, a force that promises to restore order, to cleanse the system of its corruption. They are granted exceptional powers, justified by crisis. The people, exhausted by division, welcome these measures as temporary, a means to stabilize a fractured society. But power, once consolidated, is rarely returned. The temporary soon becomes permanent. The emergency never quite ends. This is how democracy fades, not in a dramatic coup, but in a slow, almost imperceptible shift, where each step is rationalized until there is no democracy left to defend. The shadows of Plato's cave are not just an allegory for ignorance. They are a metaphor for a system that keeps its citizens staring at illusions, mistaking performance for governance. The 24-hour news cycle feeds an unending stream of conflict, reducing politics to a series of manufactured outrages, none of which lead to resolution. The spectacle keeps the population engaged, yet disengaged, watching but never acting. The more chaotic the headlines, the less time there is to examine the structures beneath them. The philosopher king was Plato's ideal ruler, one who governed not out of self-interest but out of wisdom and duty. This was never America's model. The country was built on the idea that no one man should hold unchecked power, yet over time, the executive branch has expanded, absorbing authority once meant for the legislature and judiciary. Presidents now rule with executive orders, bypassing debate, and yet the public cheers, conditioned to see strong leadership as synonymous with progress. What was once an office designed for limited authority has, over time, become the centre of decision-making, with each administration pushing the boundaries further than the last. The fear is no longer that democracy will collapse in a single moment, but that it will be eroded so gradually that by the time the people realise what has happened, it will be too late. In the Republic, Plato warns of democracy's fatal flaw. The people, overwhelmed by the complexity of governance, will choose simplicity over substance. They will reject difficult truths in favour of comforting narratives. The leader who thrives in this environment is not the one who speaks of sacrifice, of patience, of long-term stability. It is the one who offers the easiest answers, the most satisfying villains, the most immediate gratification. This is how democracies do not die, but are willingly surrendered. And so, in America, as the machinery of influence grows more sophisticated, as elections become pageants rather than choices, as power shifts away from public institutions and into the hands of private capital, the Republic's warnings grow louder. The unravelling of a democracy does not announce itself with a singular event. There is no grand declaration, no decisive moment when the people realise they have crossed a threshold. Instead, it happens in fragments, small, almost imperceptible shifts in governance, in media, in public perception. A law amended here, a precedent ignored there. The machinery grinds on, always in motion, reshaping itself in ways that do not seem drastic in isolation, but, when viewed from a distance, reveal an unmistakable transformation. Plato saw this process clearly. Democracies, in his view, decay not because they are overthrown, but because they consume themselves from within. They begin with noble ideals, with aspirations of equality and representation. But over time, these ideals are corrupted by ambition, by the gradual erosion of civic responsibility. A society that once valued wisdom finds itself governed by those who appeal not to reason, but to emotion. In the early stages, this shift is celebrated as progress. Leaders who prioritize spectacle over substance are seen as refreshing, as breaking with the old, as giving voice to the people. But what they truly offer is distraction, an endless cycle of controversy and outrage that keeps the public engaged but never empowered. In 2025, American democracy has become an exercise in manufactured conflict. The nation is divided into carefully curated factions, each convinced that the other poses an existential threat. Social media, once heralded as a democratizing force, has become an instrument of division, its algorithms designed to keep users locked in cycles of outrage, ensuring that no issue is ever fully resolved. Politicians no longer govern, they perform. Every statement, every policy decision is calibrated for maximum engagement, designed not to solve problems but to sustain the narrative. The illusion must be maintained. The Republic speaks of a moment when a democracy, exhausted by its own instability, turns to authority. The people, tired of disorder, begin to desire control. They do not recognize this shift as a surrender of their freedom, but as a necessary correction. The leader who emerges in this moment is not a tyrant in the traditional sense. They do not seize power, they are given it. Slowly, incrementally, the boundaries of governance expand. What was once unthinkable becomes acceptable, then routine. The process is self-reinforcing. The longer a society functions under these new rules, the more natural they seem. By now, the judiciary, once a counterbalance to executive power, has been repurposed. The Supreme Court, tasked with interpreting laws, now functions as an ideological gatekeeper, ensuring that the new order is codified into permanence. It does not act independently, it reflects the priorities of those who put it in place. Judicial neutrality becomes a relic, an outdated principle that no longer aligns with the political reality. This is how democracy ceases to be a system of governance and becomes a system of control. The people still vote, but their choices are narrowed. They still debate, but their discussions are shaped by media narratives that keep them focused on surface-level disputes rather than structural change. The courts still rule, but their decisions reinforce the very inequalities they were meant to prevent. The architecture of democracy remains intact, but its purpose has been rewritten. At this stage, there is no clear path back. The institutions that once safeguarded democratic principles have adapted to the new order. Those in power no longer need to justify their actions in democratic terms. They have normalized the shift. The Republic warned of this moment, the point where a democracy no longer believes in itself but continues out of habit, its rituals maintained for the sake of appearances. Elections are still held, but their outcomes are predictable. Laws are still passed, but they serve interests beyond the public good. The nation still calls itself a democracy. The term has lost its meaning. Plato understood that democracies are not lost in a single act of tyranny, but in a slow erosion of public trust. When the people no longer believe that their voices matter, they disengage, and in their absence, power consolidates. This is the final stage, the moment when a society no longer fights against its decline, but accepts it as inevitable. In 2025, America stands at this precipice. The signs are clear, the warnings have been issued, but the question remains, will they be heeded, or will the cycle continue? The final stage of a democracy's decline does not come with a dramatic coup or an obvious descent into dictatorship. Instead, it arrives quietly, dressed in the familiar language of stability and progress. The transition is subtle enough that most do not notice it happening. The symbols of democracy remain intact: the elections, the courts, the speeches about liberty and justice, but their substance has been hollowed out. What once existed as a system of shared governance has become a mechanism of controlled participation, where the outcomes are preordained and the power structures remain untouched. Plato understood this process with unsettling clarity. In the Republic, he describes the slow transformation of democracy into something else, something more controlled, more centralized, less responsive to the will of the people. The shift is not forced upon the citizens. They accept it, piece by piece, as a necessary compromise. At first it seems reasonable. A law is passed to prevent misinformation, another to ensure public safety. Soon, policies that once would have been considered extreme are seen as practical, even necessary. The people, exhausted by the chaos of unchecked democracy, begin to welcome these changes. Over time, they stop asking whether they are losing their freedoms. They are too distracted to notice. In 2025, America is no longer governed by elected officials alone. The real power lies elsewhere, in institutions that do not answer to the public. The intelligence agencies, the defense contractors, the corporate conglomerates, these are the entities that shape policy. Presidents and senators may change, but these forces remain constant, their influence growing with each passing year. The illusion of control is carefully maintained. Citizens still vote, still argue over political ideologies, still believe in the idea of democracy. But the outcomes are predetermined by a system that no longer needs their input. The Supreme Court, once a check against government overreach, now functions as an instrument of consolidation. Rulings are made not based on legal principle, but on political alignment. Judges appointed for life are insulated from accountability, their decisions reshaping the nation in ways that serve the interests of the few rather than the many. The precedent has been set. Power is no longer something that shifts with the electoral cycle, but something that accumulates decade after decade until it is untouchable. At this stage, resistance becomes more difficult, not because the people do not see what is happening, but because the mechanisms for change have been removed. Protests still occur, but they are carefully contained. Investigations are launched, but they lead nowhere. The media reports on corruption, but nothing changes. The weight of system is too great, and the avenues for meaningful action too few. The Republic warned of this moment, the point where democracy no longer functions as a means of self-governance, but as a tool of managed participation. The people are not ruled by force, they are ruled by distraction. This is the final lesson of Plato's work. Democracies do not collapse overnight. They fade step by step into something else, something that still calls itself democracy but functions as an oligarchy. By the time the citizens realize what has happened, it is too late to reverse. The institutions they relied upon to protect them have already adapted to the new reality. In 2025, America has reached this threshold. The country still tells itself it is free, still believes in the promise of its founding principles. But beneath the surface, the structures of power have been rewritten. The warnings of the Republic were not heeded. The cycle has repeated itself once more. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. To learn more about the subjects covered today, check out the links in the show notes. Until next time.